welcome back if you left and went somewhere and then just came back, but welcome for the first time if you're here right now and you weren't here earlier. I'm Rollie Williams, the guy who takes way too long to intro everything, but I am here with two extremely special co-panelists slash guests. We got Meg Douglas and we got Molly Kawahata. Thank you guys so much for being here today.
Thanks for having us.
Of course. I'm really acting like I am the host here, but I'm kind of right where you guys are. We all got questions. We're gonna have a nice little panel discussion here. So let me just kind of kick it off with a question that everyone gets asked all the time. You're a climate communicator. You're talking to people. Your friends come up to you and they ask, "Oh, I like what you do. What can I personally do to help fight climate change?" You guys been asked this question before, and what do your answers normally sound like?
Yeah, so this is the number one question I get, and it's my favorite one because I think it's just reflective of the fact that everybody wants to be part of the solution, and a lot of people are caring more than they ever have. So the number one call to action I give folks is to register people to vote. And it's kind of an unexpected answer because it's kind of leaving the climate domain for a second and looking more at kind of like the more democracy reform area of the world. And so why do I recommend that? Well, I think that ultimately, to solve the climate crisis, truly, we need systemic change. Individual action of greening our lives is just not going to be scalable, and it's not, the numbers just don't add up. What we ultimately need is policy, government action, campaigns, and elections. So when we can do that, when we expand the electorate, when we enfranchise more folks that haven't had a voice before, ultimately what happens is that progressives and climate candidates get elected. That's the end result. And they are able to put systemic policy in place that impact all of our lives in every facet of life.
That's a great answer. Meg, do you have is this a common occurrence in your life? You have people knocking down your door asking what they can personally do?
No, I wouldn't say that I'm a well-known climate change advocate. No, I mean, I always just encourage people to get informed. So I'll send them to your podcast. I'll send them on for information. I think it's important to have kind of a community around you to find out ways to always stay active, because to Molly's point, it's like keep doing all the things you're doing, but we need to think a little bit bigger than that to really affect change.
Yeah, do everything you're doing and now triple it. So that's what we call a little cold open in the biz. Right out of the gates, we ask a question, but let's dial it back just a little bit. And can you guys kind of describe what your background is and why you're here today on the panel?
Sure. So my name is Molly, like Rollie mentioned. I am a climate communicator as well, and the founder of Systemic Impact Strategies, as well as the former energy and climate policy advisor for the Obama White House.
Ooh, big credit there. Big credit on the resume. All right. Way to go, Molly.
And much less impressive pedigree. My name is Meg Douglas. I'm a creative director at Huge, which is a kind of business transformation, advertising, product marketing. I've been doing this for a long time. My whole career has been in advertising and kind of bringing big brand stories to life, and honestly bringing big brand actions to life as well. So it's something that after a couple decades doing it, you're like, let's start pointing things to good.
Awesome. And my name is Rollie Williams. I'm a comedian slash climate science and policy master's degree haver. And I also have a lot of student debt that came with that. So that's a bummer. I have a YouTube show that's called Climate Town. So you just go to Climate Town and or go to YouTube and search Climate Town if you're interested, where the premise is like I just try to do like John Oliver sort of style videos about various elements of the climate crisis. I try to make them funny, despite the fact that the subject matter is, pretty punishingly not funny. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. Okay, now that's good. We got our cold open, we got our intro, and now we're back into the meat of the piece here for all those structure heads keeping track at home. Now, Meg, you've got a lot of direct experience with corporations who are trying to do good while they're also trying to obviously maximize their profits. And you spoke about the problem behind the problem. Can you kind of describe what that means and how that affects the climate crisis?
Well, I guess to bring it completely out of climate, just the way that we approach any sort of communications is looking at, like, obviously there's a business problem. But then there's like, what's the real problem? What's the consumer problem? What's the reason that consumers aren't thinking of your business in the right way? And my favorite example, to bring it a little closer to kind of positive action, is the Truth Campaign. It's probably like the best reframing exercise in history, because you would think, and for many years they did think, the problem was teenagers are smoking. But the problem behind the problem was actually that teenagers think smoking is cool. And like, it's a sign that you're rebellious. And so the more ads they put out, kind of finger wagging and saying smoking is bad for this reason and you shouldn't do it and everything else, it was almost feeding the rebellion, and more teenagers were smoking. So until they got to that problem behind the problem, they couldn't unlock how to actually speak to teenagers. And then once they did that, they realized, like, if rebellion is the thing, and if it's all about like, fuck the establishment, if I can say that,
I don't
then
think you can, Meg. I think we're
then
gonna
we
have
need
Greg
to,
edit that a little bit.
right? But we need to tell the story, the real story, which is basically the tobacco companies knew that teenagers thought that smoking was cool and that it was rebellious. And so they didn't care that you were putting out facts about how scary it was. But when you reframe that and you actually say, hey, teenagers, the tobacco company wants you to smoke. Like, that's the reason they're doing this. The establishment is tricking you and you're a pawn in that game. That just like lit a fire under all teenagers. They delivered the campaign from the voice of teenagers. It became something that the teenage audience owned, and they were like calling out big tobacco. It became this huge kind of well orchestrated, but grassroots rebellion against smoking. And it worked for several years. So I love it as the, like, making sure that you're looking at the problem from the consumer's point of view, from the people whose mind you're trying to change, or from the people who you're trying to get kind of motivated. And once you do that, it unlocks the insights that really drive people to get involved.
Mm. Interesting. And as part of that, Molly, why haven't we made more progress on climate change?
Well, I think Meg is making a really important point about the problem behind the problem. And ultimately, what I started to realize is that, in the policy world, you can try to put forth everything, but ultimately you need the American people on board. And to get systemic change, you need policy. To get policy, you need the public support. And to get public support, you have to make them feel something. So I started to realize that climate change is a fight that we're fighting in the streets, we're fighting at desks, but it's also something that we need to address in people's minds. And I think that's what Meg is getting at, this idea that like smoking was cool. When you think about climate action, we have a lot of emotions in the human mind and body that are associated with how people receive information and how we've been giving it. And they're largely fear, guilt, and shame, right? We like put a ton of imagery and content out there of natural disasters that scare people. We shame them and guilt them for the fact that they exist and live their lives through this concept that's been fabricated by the oil and gas companies of climate guilt. We've done a lot of stuff that make people feel genuinely like they have to just sit back and can't take action. So I think when we can reframe this issue as one around opportunity, which I really believe this is, like the climate crisis represents the greatest economic opportunity of the 21st century. And that's something we had President Obama say all the time. When we can frame it that way in terms of opportunity, the opportunity to clean up the air for frontline communities, to put people back to work, to invest in communities that have been left behind, there's so much more of an uplifting, inspirational, exciting moment that we're also facing, as much as a dire one. But when we think about human psychology, a way more motivating, like human emotion framing we should run with is this idea of momentum, feasibility, and opportunity.
It's like the difference between being a part of a positive change movement and like sticking your finger in the dam so we don't all explode.
Yeah,
exactly.
Like, because the latter seems like you're kind of just rearranging deck chairs, right?
Now I got to ask Molly, where was this narrative coming from? Is this like, it's your fault, here are disasters, you should be, like sit back? Like what? I'm trying to think of a specific place where that kind of message might have emanated, and I'm not exactly sure where it was coming from.
Yeah, so there's one, I've been thinking about this too. And Rollie, I'd actually love to hear your insight on this with some of the content you put out around the carbon footprint and kind of the history and story behind it. Um, Ultimately, like if you search YouTube for climate change and you just see what comes up, besides Climate Town, in my opinion, it is horrifying what you will see. Like it is all of these films that National Geographic puts out, that CNN has put out, that Al Gore has put out, that just show people how bad it's going to be. And in some ways, there's a rationale behind this, right? Which is like, again, not evidence-based necessarily, but it's this idea that seems rational that if we can just scare people enough, we can show them that how bad it would be will make them feel so scared, they will fight to change that outcome. Rationally, that makes sense. In terms of human psychology, it does not, because fear, guilt, and shame are demotivating, not motivating emotions. So I honestly think like when I watched, I haven't actually seen An Inconvenient Truth, but first off, it's a film about a PowerPoint. You're like,
I mean, Molly, don't go knocking Inconvenient Truth. That
I was gonna say it is. It was
it won an
surprisingly.
I honestly, when I saw the preview, it's like all caps, black background, like your children, if you care. It's like showing like
passionate Al Gore.
Wildfire. It's like a graph of data going up. In my opinion, it is all the wrong messaging. And when I watched it, I was just like, this set the stage for the climate narrative for the next 20 years. I think that's really concerning. And we've spent the last decade, and this is something we really did under President Obama, is try to reframe climate in terms of public health and in terms of an uplifting opportunity message for that reason, countering that narrative. I think that's part of what made people not want to act and not feel like they can, and expanded this idea of climate guilt. So I think documentary films have actually played a really big role. And again, great source material, great visual content you can use, great localized stories, but framing this in a way that's been counterintuitive and destructive.
Well, I think the other piece that though is the documentary films, in any of the communication that's happened in terms of like fear mongering, it's fear mongering for such a big problem that there's nothing you can do. So that's to me the part of the reason too that leaves people just like, no matter what I do, I'm rearranging deck chairs because we're all going down. And it's like, that's how are you going to get motivated to like, turn your water heater down, like use best individual practices when it starts to feel that overwhelming, versus saying like, this is the way we can move towards positive change, and framing it in a more like, in a way that makes people feel like they can actually do something.
Now, I guess I'm wondering whether that first step is an important part of getting the message of climate change out there, because I think An Inconvenient Truth, which Molly, you should watch, it's really good. But I think it's, like we needed a big, hey, this is happening. I think before that, it was just kind of like, like what were the big benchmarks? There was like the 1988 James Hansen congressional testimony, which like, I mean, I'm sure it was riveting at the time, but no one like watched that. And then, we had a 20-year period, and then we have this documentary that kind of reframes climate change in terms of like as a global thing. It sort of feels like we kind of needed a lot of these like clarion calls of like, this is a global problem, and then to dial it back to a local issue, or do you feel as though that was a missed opportunity to go straight from like kind of an unknown issue on a global scale to like, this is a big opportunity more than it is like everybody should, get depressed?
Yeah, and I think important clarion call moments are extremely important, and that's what we're trying to build today. I honestly think another one to add to that are moments that have been counterintuitive, like BP's Ogilvy and May, their carbon footprint campaign. That's another one that injected a lot of energy into the environmental movement, and I think has led a lot of people in some ways astray in terms of their focus.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I have a look, I mean, not to toot my own horn here, but if you go to YouTube and you type in "carbon footprint is a scam," or I think that was the title. I made like a 10-minute video about this. A lot of great people have written about this. You got your Dr. Jeffrey Suprin, Dr. Naomi Oreskes, Mark Kaufman, right?
Mhm.
I just want to make sure
Mashable.
that was, what's up?
Mashable. Yeah.
Mashable, that's right. Mashable, baby. There's some great pieces on this topic, and the topic is like British Petroleum literally invented the phrase carbon footprint. This phrase that we are now using and green groups are using now. And you know, they use this company Ogilvy and Mather to like kind of individualize the problem, to remove it from a systemic purview into like, oh, what can I do to change how I am causing climate change? And it really short-circuited collective action by making people like kind of turn inward and stop thinking about, let's hold companies accountable. So in terms of a messaging thing, like all these major oil companies are really nailing it on how to get people to stop realizing that it's the oil majors who are behind a lot of this.
Do you think the objective of that was to short circuit collective action?
I think, if I'm being totally honest, I think the objective was for one marketing department in one company to make it seem as though British Petroleum wasn't part of the problem and was in fact part of the solution. I don't think there was this big like, you know, insidious, ooh, if we can get climate change really cooking, then, you know, the Arctic will melt, or what, you know, like I don't think it was like these bad boys in a dark room with like shadowy faces, but I certainly think the intent was to keep British Petroleum out of the crosshairs of the public. And I think it did an incredible job. And partially because, you know, it's not exactly wrong. You know, like all of us do have this, you know, like if you take the global carbon budget, you can section it off on a per capita basis, and you can sort of do the math and you can realize, okay, more people burning this amount of carbon, you know, it's like it makes sense. It's like an intuitive idea, but it's also a deeply flawed one that breaks in the direction of the oil companies, and those dudes don't need help. They have $1 trillion.
Yeah, and I think this was exactly, it's intended to completely deflect and
Yeah.
reframe the issue away from them and onto the individuals. I actually don't really think it's super intuitive. I think it seems to me completely like a made up, fabricated concept that we can take a system based in fossil fuels and we can apportion blame onto the end users who are forced to use it. Because when I take a carbon calculator test, it blames me for the electricity system, it blames me for the transportation system, it even blames me for parts of industry. Ultimately, like when I plug my phone in at night or turn my lights on at night, it's blaming me for the electrons that are on that grid that are coming from fossil fuels. But I don't choose where my electrons come from. I'm living in the only system I've been given. So to me, it's this idea of like inventing this idea. Like the other part of this is they invented, as a consequence of like, what can I do? They also invented climate guilt. And climate guilt is something that I know a lot of conscious climate folks talk to me, they can't sleep at night. The New York Times just wrote an article about how climate change is entering the therapy room because people are so overcome with paralyzing fear and helplessness around climate change that it's literally impacting their health and their lives and their ability to like be happy. Ultimately, when we invented this idea of we, right, we started saying, look what we've done, look at this problem we've caused, we've created. That is a very different thing from saying we have a system based in fossil fuels that has been creating this problem of climate change, and we need to change the system in order to ensure our children have a healthy and viable future. So what I think, we is a powerful word and I want us to use it, but we need to reframe it in terms of action. Right? Collective individual action. I agree, Meg. It is impactful, but it has to be individual action that leads towards systemic change, not individual action that ends at you. Because ending at, you know, biking to work and doing your laundry at 9 p.m. Again, do it if you can and you have the privilege of being able to do those things. By all means, don't change what you're doing. I'm asking people to just change their focus a little bit so we can focus more on how to actually regulate these industries in a way that will have impact for our children's future.
Mm. And I tend to take a pretty cynical view of the corporate mindset. Meg, this is kind of a question for your expertise. It seems as though like, oh, you have a billion dollar company, and the only thing they're concerned about is like how to make that B into a T. Not like how to like rejuvenate the globe and the world that they are taking from, but how to just continue to be more efficient in their growth. But I don't want to be that cynical if it's not warranted. So can you kind of give me a sense of whether like that cynicism is real, or are there companies that are trying to do really good work and genuinely attempting that, or anything like that?
I mean, I think, we're at corporate America, like the point is to make money. That is the point of every business. They don't exist if they don't make money. It's how you're willing to get there and what you're willing to kind of hold true as your values and your value system, your company's culture. How much are you willing to kind of walk the walk? I think because, yeah, ultimately companies exist to make money, but companies are all made up of people, most of whom of who I've worked with, like they want to be doing good in the world. It's not, it's not like a Wall Street barrel focus of just like profit at everyone else's expense. I think the Ogilvy work that you're talking about is interesting because I imagine that the creative team had all the best intentions of let's help people feel like they can do something about this, not like mwahaha, let's decentralize action and let the world fail, because like nobody is going to win in that situation. But I think that there's definitely, especially from an advertising standpoint, there's a lot of soul searching and like moral dilemma moments where you want to be like, you sleep at night because you find the truth in something. You found an insight, you've unlocked it, you have this magical moment with your audience. It's a very vulnerable moment that you've unlocked. You've reframed something that they know that they've never heard of in this way before. You have their attention, and attention is so valuable. You can't screw it up. Like you can't bullshit them. You can't really deliver something that you feel like is untrue. So you need to figure out like, what is the truth? What can we actually say that feels honest to who the brand is and who they are as a company, but also honest to people? Because otherwise people will go from they weren't paying attention at all, they're completely complacent, and then you turn them into cynics if you bullshit them. So you just turn off a whole audience. As a long and winding way to defending corporate America. Not really.
Meg, I'd be curious to know, actually, just like from your work, what goes into, like, what components go into compelling people to either change their opinion or act?
I mean, I think the first step, like I said earlier, was about figuring out what problem we're actually solving for and knowing the end action that you want to achieve. But the journey to get there is really, I mean, I think the interesting thing with the three of us is like, I look to comedy for insights. I look to research for insights and data, but it's like ultimately that human insight moment is the thing that's going to get you, like, where do our values overlap? Where is there a need that I can actually answer? Where is there a way to build something into your life that will help you, that'll answer a need that you might not be necessarily asking for? And I think when you find those shared value moments, that's when you can start to see communities come together and naturally kind of form around action.
Interesting. Now, Meg, on the flip side of that, I think it's really important to when the advertising is kind of based around, oh, how can we kind of make a positive change? I think that's like a critical piece. I'm working with this other company called Clean Creatives, who are encouraging advertisers to like stop working with fossil fuel companies completely, just because like there's basically no work that you can do as an advertiser for a fossil fuel company that is an actual positive change. How would you like, I'm sure you've seen, advertisers working with fossil fuel companies. Do you tend to share that kind of idea that like there's no positive change out of here? Or how do you feel like that gets justified to ad companies who then work with fossils?
I mean, I don't know because I've never been put in this situation. So I don't know the ins and outs of like what happens behind the scenes. I think ultimately though, like for example, Google is one of our biggest clients, but it was a values conversation from the very beginning. Like, my company does a lot of product design, like digital product design, physical experiences, everything. We get to kind of work with companies to look at the way products come to life, look at stuff like supply chain, look at the whole ecosystem of what a business does and affect that and make recommendations that are more responsible on behalf of the environment, on behalf of the communities that the company affects. And I think that to me, I've been lucky enough to work at places where I feel like my values are shared. I've not been put in any of those trickier situations.
But and you don't want to speculate what the mental gymnastics that somebody might have.
I mean, I feel like I just have a kind of optimistic view of humanity, probably. I hope that the conversation is we can start to affect change from the inside, but I don't know.
I would guess that you're right on that one, where people do feel as though, okay, well, if we don't take this gig, a company that cares less about the environment might take this gig. I don't know if that washes completely for me, but different strokes. Molly, do you have any insight on that?
Well, I actually don't believe it's just companies that we should focus on in terms of climate action, right? I think so much of it is about the public and about how they can kind of stand up and create change. I so agree with you. I just believe in like the inherent good in people. I'm like the ultimate climate optimist, unapologetic optimist, the way where like some people think I'm delusional about it, because I think that like I've been able to benefit from like seeing social change in huge ways in politics and government, that I just believe that we have the capacity to all take action in a way that will have systemic impact. Companies should absolutely continue using their platform for advocacy as well as looking to decarbonize their operations. But I think ultimately we all need to be focusing on systemic change.
Mm. So it sounds to me like we're sort of circling three kind of important pieces, which is like public will, corporate buy-in, and like political change. Does that sound right, Molly and Meg?
Yeah, I think that
Tracks.
makes sense. I just think some like have like tend to be weighted more than others.
And that was wow. Do you have my notes there? Like that's the next question. What? Yeah. How do if you could only focus on one, and I mean obviously this will not be solved by only focusing on one, but if you could only focus on one, both Meg and Molly, what do you think is the one to focus on, or what do you think is the one that you are going to focus on, or should be focused on?
I might actually add one thing which might be more foundational to the points that you're laying out, which to me is an open community that's welcoming to people. I think part of this whole, all of these one-off conversations, all of the actions and movements that have been taken are kind of driven by loud voices, and it can lead to people not feeling like they can kind of enter in the group. I heard this great quote last week that was like, is there room in the woke for the waking? And it's just about like lowering barriers to entry to let people ask the stupid questions and make people feel like, and I've done this on behalf of brands before, but how do you kind of use your strongest advocates as a way to open the gates rather than kind of charging forward and you're either with us or against us mentality. So I think with an open and welcoming community building effort, you can hit those 3 points with weight.
Mm.
I wholeheartedly agree. And I actually think that part of the downsides and kind of why there's been this like climate movement that's been building alongside an environmental movement is that the environmental movement historically has not been one that's been focused on inclusivity. In fact, it has very racist roots. And so when we can look at basically, and again, tying back to the carbon footprint concept, we created these huge barriers to entry into the environmental movement, and saying, if you're doing anything that's impacting the planet in some way, we're going to call you out on social media. We're going to say that that you shouldn't have any voice, you're a hypocrite, all of these things that have created barriers to entry that make a lot of people not feel welcome or even like they can be a part of it, especially folks that don't have that luxury and that privilege, right? Like when we focus purely on the environmental frame around climate, what we ultimately do is we talk about polar bears in the Arctic and glaciers melting, which again are important components of conversation, especially for those who live in that domain, like scientists. But mom working 2 jobs in the Midwest doesn't always have the luxury of caring about things happening thousands and thousands of miles away. So I think
for offsets.
yeah, like
what if that mom doesn't own a polar bear? Like she's not going to care.
And so ultimately what I'm getting at, right, is this idea of like, we need to make the climate movement more inclusive. And the second part of that is make the climate movement fight for everybody. Yeah. And that's what systemic change looks like.
Excellent. Yeah. So, I mean, ultimately I kind of framed it as like, is it people? Is it corporations? Is it politics? But like people make up corporations and politics, so maybe the thing that we're really hammering on is like, let's kind of get everybody educated and together and present the facts as they are to all these people and trust that people will make the right decision when given the truth of the situation, and not like trying to guilt them, not trying to manipulate them, not trying to scare them into action, but just kind of like, here is the situation at hand. You are a smart person. We're all smart people on this planet. Like we can do this if we work together and trust that we'll do it. Maybe that's the solution.
And serve up the truth in a way that makes people feel something. Yeah. I think that's the other piece, is like, think about what is it that where do we need to hit? Because the truth is big. There are 1,000, ways to frame it. And I think the interesting moment will be when people start to feel like it affects them personally.
Mm.
Yeah. And I think you're both spot on like this empowerment narrative. That's why we need to reframe the conversation, kind of like what we're getting at in this conversation. It's about reframing, because that's how you meet people where they are. That I know, Meg, is part of your work, Rollie, with like what you're doing with Climate Town and using comedy to reach new people. When we can reframe the narrative, other things follow. That's what I believe. And like, again, that's the theory of change we're working from, right? Like meet people where they are, they care. That's how we can ultimately get systemic change to actually solve the climate crisis. And I think one important thing also, and there are a lot of misconceptions around this, is if you look at the numbers, the public is squarely behind climate action. Climate deniers, which we have given this idea of climate deniers like way too much airtime, there almost none of them exist. It's ultimately the American people want action, but you have to look at kind of why have they wanted action, but the people who represent them have not taken it. And when you think about kind of democracy, there are these barriers that are happening in between that are making it so there's this disproportionate number of climate deniers in Congress that aren't reflective of the people. And ultimately, I think that comes down to a lot of democracy reform components, right? Like campaign finance reform. When you take away the ability for fossil fuel companies to buy candidates, that changes who they care about, who they represent, what equities they're fighting for. When you get rid of the filibuster, that's going to really change how much the American people and their sentiment is represented in decisions. When you can register more people to vote, that changes who's actually represented in that changes like who the electorate is pushing forward. And when you can fight voter suppression, you ensure that communities of color, that their voices are still there. And they're kind of the original climate activists, right? Like communities of color that have been fighting for clean air and clean water for their children for decades, long before climate change was even a term. So I really think it does come back to people every time. And I do believe that all of them kind of want to take action in a really authentic, real way in order to change the system. We just haven't given them the tools to know how.
Dang, Molly, way to stick the landing on that talk. Terrific. And that, my friends, is the conclusion. Meg, Molly, thank you guys so much for jumping on. I really appreciate it.
It was a pleasure.
It was awesome. Thank you.
Thank you. And then do you have anything to plug? Where can the people find you guys online? If you guys want.
I'm like, you can't find me. I'm in rural North Carolina on the coast.
Awesome.
I'm currently putting up a website that I have not done for months and months, but it will be up at some point. My firm, Systemic Impact Strategies, is online for folks that, are interested in kind of the climate consultancy world.
Gotcha. And that was just kind of a knee-jerk reaction from me because I talk to comedians all day, and they're like, yeah, I got a show at the Chuckle House on Tuesday, and you can find me on Twitter. So,
Like I work from home at Huge. The
What's
end.
that?
I said I work from home for Huge. That's
Great.
that's where I am all the time.
I have
When's
an
your next
Instagram
stand-up
account
set?
where I complain about climate. Like we don't really have much like planned here.
Got it. Well, you guys, as they say, we'll get that part in post. Go ahead and if you want a little more vitamin me in your life, you can go to YouTube and search Climate Town. But honestly, live your life. You know, do your thing. Everyone out there, thank you so much for checking it out. And that's the end of the discussion. Cue the news music.